Recently, there's been a lot of talk about doing auth on your own or versus using a company. And I won't name any names, but recently one of the companies went offline for, I think it was hours or maybe minutes. But this kind of triggered the conversation on should you roll your own auth or rely on another company to store your auth data, which you call via API, which when they go down is your entire app is dysfunctional. Now, I'm not 100% proponent of just rolling your own auth because you want to be in control. Because, I mean, if your app goes down, you'll have the same issue. So you could argue that perhaps their uptime is better than yours will be. But anyway, today we're going to look at Nuxt Auth Utils to be able to roll your own auth within Nuxt. I've set up a little diagram quickly just to go over the entire overview of like what Nuxt Auth Utils does. This isn't everything, but it's the basic idea. And by knowing this, we could sort of go along and implement a small app that uses auth to show you how to use all these different things. So I think the entire flow starts over here in the browser. The user opens up your web page and they see either a login page or they have some sort of landing page, and then they have to navigate to some sort of dashboard or where they see their own data. Before they can do that, they need to log in. So usually that's email, password, or you could use OAuth with like Google or GitHub or anything like that. And we'll look at a couple of those examples, how to set it up. What happens when you log in is you use either one of these providers, your own email password, or you can use passkeys or OAuth. But the important thing to realize is that it's your responsibility to validate the request coming into your server. So Nuxt Auth Utils isn't a full-on thing that talks to your database and does all the database updates and expects certain schemas. That is your responsibility. Nuxt Auth Utils just provides you utilities, hence utils, to do this. Once you've handled all the business logic of checking the email and password and creating the user in your database, then you can use the set user session to set a session on the request, which is basically a cookie, an encrypted cookie using a encryption token in your ENV. We'll have a look at that when we implement it, but that sets it on the request, sends it back to the client, which then sees the set cookie and puts the cookie in your browser cookies. One thing to note is that cookies have a limit on their size. So the more data you put in your cookie, the bigger the cookie text will be because it's encrypted. I think that size is 4096 bytes, which is 4 kibibytes, K with a small b. And anyway, so that request comes into your Nitro server. You do all your business logic. Nitro server handles things like the encryption and decryption of the cookie when you use set user session or replace user session. You can add extra data to your user object by implementing a fetch plugin that Nitro or Nuxt allows you to do. You can also basically, like I said, the business logic is your responsibility. You need to make sure that the user has entered valid credentials and the user exists in the database. On a register endpoint, you have to make sure their password is strong enough. You have to make sure that you hash their password, and Nuxt Auth Utils also provides you nice little functions to hash passwords, so you don't have to do that yourself with like a specific hash function. Then again, Nuxt Auth Utils does not do database operations. You have to call your database, and we're going to set up a little SQLite database just to do that. And another thing that Nuxt Auth Utils provides is simple OAuth wrappers. So you can see that they support 40 plus OAuth providers. So OAuth, just to sum it up, is basically it defers all the checking if this user exists and stuff to a third-party platform. If your user already has an Apple account, all we have to do is provide the credentials and stuff to send a request to Apple to say like, hey, this user wants to authenticate to our app using the data that they've stored in Apple. Can we get that data, please, so that we can put it in our database and make sure this user is who they say they are. The benefits of that is when you use email password validation, usually you want to send a confirmation email. to make sure that the user actually owns the email address. Otherwise, they can just put in any email address and create an account, which doesn't identify them correctly, which means you have to put middleware like defining if the user hasn't verified, they still can't access. When you use something like OAuth, they've probably already done that through these providers. So when you create an account on GitHub, you have to confirm your email. So if we ask GitHub for this user's information, then we don't have to check again if this is actually their email because GitHub has already handled that for us. So OAuth is pretty cool. The downside of this is not everyone has a GitHub account, not everyone has a Facebook account, not everyone has, these different types of accounts. So when you show your login page, you're going to have a huge list of buttons to see like, oh, does this user have Google? Does this user have GitHub? If they want to use those. So the UI for that could be a little bit confusing or just overbearing. Then once we have this user set up in our database and we set the user session, that cookie would be sent back to the browser, like I said, to put in the cookies. And every time the browser makes a request, and also you can do this in use async data from the server side, we'll look at all of this in code, then it passes that cookie along so that the Nitro server can identify that user with the decryption and everything. And you also get the extra info that you want to provide on your user object. Finally, we also have the browser side of things. You can again get the user details from your cookie by making a request to a special endpoint, which you don't have to do. It's done by Nuxt Auth Utils itself. You send the cookie and it sends back the user information, which is why you don't want to put sensitive information in the cookie, just something that can identify the user. It gives useful composables to get the user, to get the auth state, is the user logged in, to refresh the session, all those kind of things. It has a nice auth state component, which allows you to show different UI based on logged in or logged out. And it simplifies protecting your pages with middleware. Like if the user goes to /dashboard and they don't have a session, you can easily check by using use user session if they don't redirect back to login. Simple few line check. And then there's a fetch helper to get fresh data from the server. So that's basically a overview of like the flow that this might have. And right now we're going to build an application that has auth implemented. We're going to use email and password. I'm going to show one example of probably one auth provider just so you see the kind of flow that has, but I'm probably not going to have like the actual credentials put in there because this video will get way too long. If we want to dive more into OAuth, let's make another video, but the focus of this video is email and password, register, login. We're going to build the forms. We're going to build the protected page. We're going to build the login page. We're going to build in the reading of the cookie, the middleware, all the different kind of things. And we're going to build a little SQLite database with Drizzle just to show you how you would put this user in your database and verify everything. So without further ado, this is going to be a pretty long video, I think, but let's get started. Okay, so we are going to start from complete scratch. This is going to be like a long form tutorial. I'm going to try and add chapters so you can skip certain parts or only see what you want to see. The first step is we're going to create a new Nuxt application with npx or bunx. So you can do npx, but I like using bun for this. So I'm going to do bunx nuxi at latest init, and then just call our app something like Nuxt Auth Tutorial. And that's going to create the app. We want to use bun for our installer, and let's just install these dependencies and get started. But the nice thing about the nuxi command is that you can actually get your some of these modules predefined. I'm going to add ESLint just to make everything a little bit better. I'm also going to add the UI library so that we can easily create UI that looks decent and not terrible. I wish that the Auth Utils module was included here, but I guess people don't use it often enough for it to be included in the base. So I'm just going to install those two with the setup. Then we'll go into the app and then we'll manually add, well, not really manually, we'll use the CLI to add Auth Utils as well. Now that I've seeded into the application, what I'm going to do is say bunx nuxi modules, I believe it's modules and not module, might be module, add auth Utils. See what that does. It does work, so it's module with a single without the S. And then what this is going to do, it's going to install the dependencies, and it's going to add Nuxt Auth Utils to your modules in your Nuxt config. So let's go have a look at what changes it made. This is basically, this last part is the change it added over here. So right off the bat, what I like to do is configure the Nuxt Auth Utils because it comes with some defaults, and I believe you do this in runtime config, and then there's a key called session. And in here is where we define our settings for the Nuxt config. So the first thing is we'll define password as a empty string because we're going to put this in our env, and that will replace the empty string. The next thing I'm going to configure is the cookie settings. So I want my cookie to have a different name because by default it will always have the same. If you have many applications running locally, you're going to have conflict in your cookie name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, we call this project Nuxt Auth Utils tutorial. So I'm going to say it's the NAU session, Nuxt Auth Utils session. And I'm going to configure the cookie to have a max age of, let's say, I think this is supposed to be seconds. Yes, in seconds. So let's do 60 seconds is a minute, and 24 hours, and then 7. We'll make the cookie last 7 days so that users don't have to keep logging in. Remember, if you're working on something like finance app or something like that, you might need to shorten this. One of the things that's important is when you use something like a provider that already does all this for you, they might already be compliant to like SOC 2 or some ISO things. And if you roll your own auth like this, you will have to do an audit to enable to be compliant to those things. So it's just one thing to keep in mind, but I think people overestimate the size of their application way too early, and rolling your own auth is not as terrible as people say it is. So we'll be adding the GitHub OAuth as an example. And if you look at the Nuxt documentation, at the Auth Utils documentation, you can see that all of the OAuth providers use a Nuxt OAuth provider client ID and Nuxt OAuth provider client secret. So if you go to your GitHub account, so /settings/developers, you can create a new OAuth app. You give it a name, you give it the homepage URL, which is basically where it redirects to, and describe your application. And the callback URL is where it redirects to, but you can define your homepage as like your personal site or something so that users can read more information about that. And then the callback URL is very important. This is what you'll use to call back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the application name is Nuxt. I'm going to call it NAU tutorial, just like a thing. I'm going to give my homepage www.kaizen.com.na and just an app to test GitHub OAuth with Nuxt Auth Utils. And then the callback URL, in this case, we're going to put this in as, for now, we'll put it just as the localhost 3000 / OAuth / verify. Actually, let's make this OAuth / GitHub because we might have multiple providers. And once you register your application, you should get all your credentials. If you look at the documentation for OAuth handlers, we need a client ID and client secret. So once you see that, make sure to copy it into Nuxt OAuth. And then this provider, replace that with GitHub, all capital letters, or Google, etc. Whatever you used. And then this is the function that we'll define in a route. We'll do a server route that basically, instead of auth, we'll do OAuth and then github.get.ts. But we'll do that in the code. For now, create the application so you get your tokens. Once you've created your app, you'll see a client ID, which you need to put in the env, and then generate a new secret, which you also need to put in the env. I'm going to do that quickly. Just to show you, this is what your env should look like. The other thing that you need to do is create a Nuxt session password. And this should be a 32 character random string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my terminal, and I usually just do this. I'm going to say node to enter node, and then require crypto.random_bytes with a length of 32.2 string and just say hex. And then that gives you that random string. You can copy that. And then back in your env, in Nuxt session password, you can paste that random string. So that's just to set up your password. And then finally, we need to add the redirect URL. The Nuxt OAuth provider redirect URL is the env key that you need to use for that. So if we go back to env and then paste that in there and replace provider with GitHub, then we can add this as HTTP localhost 3000 / we made this a route, so we're just gonna say OAuth /GitHub without the callback. And that's it. So we have our redirect URL, we have our session password. So we're gonna have either email and password or GitHub login, just so that we can show both. And that basically sets up the environment for us. We already have everything we need to get started. Okay, so I'm also going to show you how to set up Drizzle. I could have left this out, but maybe it's also interesting. So I'm gonna add Drizzle. I'm doing this off the top of my head, out of muscle memory, so I might be wrong about these things, but we'll see. And then we also need Drizzle Kit. So Drizzle ORM as a dependency and Drizzle Kit as a development dependency. Now that we have Drizzle installed, we can create a drizzle.config.ts, and I believe we can do something like so we can import I think it's define config from Drizzle Kit, or is it from Drizzle ORM? Yeah, so we can export default define config. We're going to say that the dialect is going to be SQLite. We're going to add an out, which is going to be in our server folder, and then database and Drizzle, I think. And we're going to say the schema is going to live in server database schema.ts. Let's just add the full path like that. And I think that might be all we need. Actually, we also need to define the DB credentials, which would be a URL. But in this case, we're just going to use a file. We're going to say that this is going to live in .data. Well, we'll just make it database.sqlite. So you might want to use something more strict. And then in our git ignore, we'll just ignore database.sqlite, just to make sure we don't have that pushed up to our GitHub. And then drizzle config, so we have that URL file database SQLite, and not .database. And what we want to do is we also want to install a driver. So I'm going to use the libsql driver. So to install that, we can do bun add libsql and then do client, which is basically it's a different type of driver on top of SQLite that adds some niceties, and it is the engine of Terso database. So after we've added our libsql client, we can go back to our config, which is all good. We're going to add a few scripts in our, so we're going to add a few scripts to generate our migrations. So I'm going to do migrations make, and we'll just do drizzle kit generate, and then migrations push is going to be drizzle kit push. I believe those are the two commands. Actually, this is not push because we don't have a remote database. This is migrate. So what that's going to do is going to read our config. It's going to see that it needs to look at our schema to generate, and it's also going to see where it needs to migrate it to. So now we can go into server, create a folder called database. We want to create our schema, and we're only going to import SQLite table from Drizzle ORM SQLite core, and we're going to say export const users is going to be a SQLite table. And instead of doing it like that, I'm going to do it in this functional way. Otherwise, we have to import like something like text and all this kind of stuff. But now it's all on this. And I think I might have made a, oh yeah, I need a comma. So this is the table basically. So our users are going to have an ID, and we're just going to do a primary key like that. And I believe we can do auto. Okay, so first of all, this is a mistake. This needs to be an object. So we get that. Integer is that, but on primary key, we want to define an auto increment of true. So every user basically just gets the next ID. So the user will have an ID, they'll have an email, which is going to be t.text, and this is not null. You always need the not null, and it also has to be unique. Every account needs a unique email, and we also want a password. And I like defining password hash like this, just to basically make sure that it's a hash and not just a password. T.text not null, and we could say something like created at would be a t dot. I think we'll do text. Actually, let's do integer, and then created at. We don't need to define the name. We also don't need to define the name. Yeah, let Drizzle handle that for us. And then in integer, we could say something like there's a thing called mode, and then we'll say timestamp milliseconds, which basically gives you that. And we'll add a default function of date.now. Actually, this needs to be new date because Drizzle automatically converts it into the integer. And then what we want to do is perhaps do an updated at. We can do the same thing. We also need a default function, and we can do a on update. No, not a comma. We can do something like on update is also a new date. So we don't have to care about doing all that stuff. So we can make this not null. And I think that's maybe all we need. So let's maybe give the user a name as well. It will be a t.text not null. So that's our basic user that we'll be using to authenticate and show some cool things. So just a caveat here, this is the first step where you kind of have control over how you want to do your auth. You could also say something like export const sessions, which is a table that basically stores a session ID, which you can control from your database. So you would get the session ID and link it to the Nuxt session. Which means that if the user is logged in, it doesn't only rely on the cookie, it also relies on your session within the database. That gives you control to basically de-authorize or de-authenticate the user from your end. Let's say there's been some sort of breach or massive issues, and the user has a cookie that's still safe for 7 days. You can't do anything about that because your app just decrypts the cookie the whole time. But if you add something like a session, then you can delete the session from your database, which invalidates the Nuxt session then as well. But we're going to keep it simple with just a this normal users object. So now that we have our user table, we can already generate the migration. So we can do something like bun, and I already forgot, I think it's called migrations generate. Yeah, so already forgot what I named this. Called it migrations make. That's not really let's just do generate, and let's do migrate. Okay, so it will be easier to remember. So we can do bun migrations generate, and it's going to look at your config, and you can see it created our SQL migration within our server database Drizzle. You can see that it created all the things we need. So what we want to do now is run the migration. We can already put this in our SQLite file. We can say bun migrations migrate, I think, and there we go. So we have all our migrations set up. If you use something like Nuxt Hub, following the documentation, you don't have to manually generate these migrations, but it's just a small step for you to do. All right, so we have our database, we have no API routes, and we have an application. So the first thing we can do is basically just create our utils, and we're gonna say Drizzle. I think let's call this database.ts. And then over here, we're gonna import Drizzle from the Drizzle ORM, not SQLite, but libsql. And we're gonna export const db equals Drizzle. And over here is where we define the path of the file, which is the same thing that we did in our root. The thing is, now we are hard coding these strings, and that might cause an issue, but let's just see how it goes. I think one thing I want to do is I want to remove this / to make it, I think it's then going to do it to the sort of present working directory, and also do the same thing in our Drizzle config, which is over here. Instead of doing that, we can just do database.sqlite, and that should allow us to run our app for the first time. We won't see anything, but now we can start working with Auth Utils. So I'm going to do bun dev and then open up the application. And if you want to read more about the SQLite docs of Drizzle, you can go to Drizzle ORM and then click on Get Started and select SQLite. And that's basically all the steps that we did with some changes. Yeah, so let's look at our app. We do indeed have an app. So let's just see that everything like the UI library and stuff like that is working by changing the app.view just to a normal H1, just saying something like hello Nuxt Auth Utils. And then we can open the app again. And you can see there's no styling, which means that we haven't set up our Nuxt UI. So to do that, because Nuxt UI is now v3, I think, we can just add an assets folder. And then in assets, we can create a CSS folder. And then in CSS, we can do a main.css. And then from here, we'll import Tailwind CSS. And we'll also import, I think it's @nuxt/UI, like that. And then yeah, I think that's basically all we need. And this should be @import. And then in our Nuxt config, we can go to this. Let's just make it CSS over here, and then add I think it's @assets, and then CSS main.css. And then let's check our terminal. Let's just restart the app and open it up in the browser. Do a little refresh, it's still loading. And then you see it, hello Nuxt Auth Utils. So it's in dark mode by default. We haven't changed the color mode, but this isn't a Nuxt UI tutorial, so we'll just stick with the base so that we can actually start working on Auth. So the first thing I want to do is I want to move away from just having an app.view and create a pages. So with the new Nuxt UI, you have to wrap everything in UApp so that you can have access to the toast and everything. And then we're going to do a Nuxt layout. We'll just have a single layout, but we'll put it there, and then Nuxt page. And this requires us to set up a pages folder. And in pages, we'll do a index.view. And we'll just say that this is the protected page. Let's just do something like this, add some spacing everywhere. We can do class equals p10 maybe, just to have it there. Make this a text XL, or let's make it 3XL, text center, and maybe font bold, just to have something on the screen for the index page. And then we'll create an auth folder. And then within auth, we'll have a login.view. We'll just add just something like a h1 login page for now. And we'll also create a register because we have to create users. So we'll do a register page. And what just happened? And there we have it. So we have a home page, which is going to be protected. We have an auth page, which has our login and register endpoints. So let's go back to our terminal, see that the app is still running. It is. And look at so now we have the protected page. If we go to /auth/login, we have the login page. If we go to /auth/register, we have the register page. So what we want to do initially is protect this home page from being accessed. And we can do that before even setting up auth. So in the root directory, if you're not using v4 compatibility mode, you can do in the root, but otherwise you need to use the app folder. I'm gonna create a middleware directory, and then in here I'm gonna say auth.ts, and over here we're gonna export default define Nuxt or route middleware. We don't have to import that. It's auto imported, and then in here we can give it a function, and this could be async. So because we have Nuxt Auth Utils installed, we have the nice helper where we can just say const session equals use user session, and this gives us access to basically all the session info. And what we can do right off the bat is just say that if there is no session dot logged in dot value, I believe. I think this is a so this is a ref. If there's no logged in value, we're gonna say return navigate to auth login. And that should already block us from accessing the homepage. But first we need to add this middleware to the page. You could do a global middleware by saying auth.global.ts, but then you have to manually specify which routes. So I prefer just doing define page meta and saying middleware is going to be auth. And you can add multiple middlewares by doing an array. So we'll just do that. And that should already block us from accessing the home page. So if you try to go to just the base route, it won't work because there is no user session. Now, if we look at the Nuxt Auth Utils doc, we kind of want to define the type of our user and session and everything so that we have access to that within everywhere in our code. So I'm just going to copy all of this and then create it within our root of our project. It's called auth.d.ts and paste everything in there. So it's basically going to extend our user. So the user is the thing on our session that we expose from the server. And remember what I said, we don't want to put like the password hash in here. We don't want to put our entire database user in here because this can be decrypted with an API request. We literally just want something to identify this user. So we could do something like ID, which will be a number. And we can also add something like the name. We don't need the email in this case. We can just do the ID and the name. And then user session is like custom fields that we add, which could be something like last logged in, could be a date, just to say that this user changed their session at this time. But we also could add something like secure session data, which is only accessible on the server side. So this could be something like an API key or anything like that, and that you only access on the secure field, which isn't available on the client. But we're not going to do that. We're going to skip that for now. And basically this is all we need on our session, just to identify the user. So now we have defined that, we can create the login endpoint. We'll create an API. So we're going to start off with just email password, and then we'll add OAuth afterwards. So we're going to create a folder called API, and then in there we're going to create probably another folder called auth, and then in there we'll create a login.post.ts, which is a post route, and then we're going to say export default define event handler, which takes in the event. And this is where we'll define all the logic to log in our user. So firstly, we kind of want a schema, and I believe we can import Zod from Zod v4 just to have the new Zod, and we can say const login schema is going to be a z.object that basically takes an email and it's going to be a z.email, and this is going to be a password z.string with a min of 8. Password must be at least 8 characters long. We could also add password confirm to make sure the user entered the same password twice, but for now we'll just do that on the client side. Should be fine. And then when the request comes in, we need to pass the body, so we can say that const body equals await read validated body on the event. And we're going to use the login schema dot parse, not parse, yeah, I think it's parse. So this will give us, it'll either throw an error or it will give us the email and password back. So now in Nuxt Auth Utils, we can import a function called hash password from imports, which means it's globally available. So we can do something like that. And we already have the DB available from the util that we defined, so we can say something like firstly we want to hash this password, so we're going to say const hashed password is equal to await hash password body.password. So this should give us a string, and what we can do now is say await db dot users. Well, I guess we can say, yeah, db dot insert into users, which is also exported, I believe, from our schema. To make life a little bit easier, we can say import star as schema from our schema or from our database schema. And then we can say something like export const tables equals schema. And then we might also want to export a couple of helpers from Drizzle. So we can say export and equal or some stuff like that. So probably that should be okay. And equal or, yeah, we'll see what else we need. So now we can go back to API auth login and we can say insert into tables.users, the values. The ID is auto-generated, so at the moment it doesn't find tables, but the types aren't being generated, so we can do LSB restart probably. To get the types, we can simply check with the LSB what we need. So we need a name, an email, and a password hash. Created at and all those things are automatically generated. So we also need to add z.string over here. We're going to say that it needs to be a min of 1 and name is required. That's the only sort of validation we do on there. We might even just say like max is 255 or something like that. We don't want to have huge names in our database. So now we have that. We can say the email is going to be body.email and the name body.name, password would be hash password. And we also need to change password to password hash. And then that's by specifying returning, it also gets the user back for us. That's not supported on MySQL, I think, but SQLite supports it. And I think this is going to give us an array of things. So yeah, the user is that thing. And I believe this is also, yeah, so it actually gives us the user if that's successful. So now what we can do is we can use the set user session on the event, and this is where we can define our different things that we need to set on the user session. And then we can simply return something like success true, which allows us to go back into our login page and start working on a form. So this is why I chose to use the Nuxt UI, because it's so easy to set up forms. We can do something like, let's add a div and say class max width, let's make it like 400 pixels and make it MX Auto. And then in here we can do a U form. And then let's define our form structure. So we're going to import z from zod/v4. And we're going to import a little type from, it's going to be form event handler, form submit event, sorry, from @nuxt/UI, so that we have that event. And then we can say our schema would be a z.object, which is going to take a name, z.string. We're going to do an email, and instead of z.string.email, we can now call z.email directly. And we can do password. z.string.min would be 8. And we can do a password confirm. And then we'll sort of validate this thing to make sure that the password confirm. And I think there's a function called check. So there's no CTX, but what we can do is we can say that if the data.value.password is not equal to the data.value.password confirm, we're going to say data.issues.push a new issue, and this issue is going to have a code of custom. We need to give it the path so that Nuxt UI knows which error to render it to, or which input to render it to, and this should be an array. And we also need to say the message which passwords do not match, and then we need to give it the input, I think. And the input is going to be the data.value.password confirm. So that's just to validate that our passwords actually match. And now we can say type schema is going to be z.output of type of schema. And we can say that our state is going to be a reactive, which maps to our schema, which is going to be a name. We'll start off empty, email starts off empty, password empty, and password confirm also empty. So in our form, we can now easily just add those. We could say that the schema is that and the state is that. And then at submit, we just want to do on login. And we can create a function which is async on login. And this is going to be the event of form submit event and the type of schema. So now if we access event.data, we can see that we get all our fields when it was successful. So now we have to define our inputs. We can do a uForm field, something like that, and finish it off like that. And then we need a u input, and we can say vmodel state.name, enter your name. That looks good. We might even add a required on here. We can copy this, paste it for email address, and the type of this input should be email, and then enter your email. And the same thing for password and password confirm. So I'm going to replace email with password, and then the label would be password. Enter your password, and this one would be query replace with the email with password confirm. Except the type is not going to be a password confirm, it's going to be a password. And instead of enter your password, we can do confirm your password. And then at the bottom here, we can add a U button that just has a type of submit. And we can say, yeah, that's basically it. And we can just say login. So that gives us basically everything we need. We can say console.log event.data just to see that we have everything. So that should be our form. Let's start our server again. So currently the form looks like this. It's already validating as we go along, but it looks kind of ugly. So I'm just going to add maybe like a on every input we could say something like, let's do this, u input, and then we'll replace u input space with u input space class equals with full, and add a space over there. See how that looks. Yeah, it looks a little better. We could basically also just add a class over here that adds a space y of 3, so everything gets split out a little bit. And there we have it. This is our login form. And I just realized that we aren't building the login form, we are building the register form, because to be able to log in, we need to be able to register. So we'll just paste that in the register page, and then just add register over here, and then call this on register. On register for the function name, and then at the bottom, instead of saying login, we can say register. And then there we have it. I think we also need to check our server, because I might have done the same thing in the server. API auth login.post is not a login route, it's a register route. So register.post.ts, and put that all in there. And instead of login schema, I'm going to rename this to register schema. That didn't work. Register schema, enter. And yeah, there we have it. So register, and then in login, it's going to not take the name. It's just going to take the email and password. We don't need to do all of this. We basically need to change this logic. So we still get the email and password, but what we don't need to check that this is minimum, because that kind of gives away info. But what we can do is we can say first get the user, find the first user where I have no idea what this is, where equal the tables.users.email from the body.email. And if the user, or if there's no user, then we're going to throw an error, and we're going to say that the status code is going to be 401, and the status message unauthorized. So now we have that, and oh, that's cool. So they give like an error message in a type, which is quite interesting. Seems like you forgot to add your schema, and that's totally true. If we go back to our utils database, instead of just Drizzle, we have to say that we have to give it the schema so it knows what our users are. So now we can go back to API auth login, and this should work. Yeah, looks like it's going to work. If there's no user, we throw. Now we have to say await verify password, which is also from Nuxt Auth Utils, and we give it the hashed password, which would be user.password hash, and we also give it the body.password. So what this is going to do, it's just going to hash this password again, and then compare the hashes to make sure that the user supplied the same hash. And then I think this is going to const result equals that. So we can say that if this didn't work, if there's no result, which means it failed, then we're still also going to throw create error unauthorized. and otherwise we're going to return true. But before we do that, we're going to set the user session again. So a lot like the register handler, except we're not creating a user, we're just getting the user based on the email, and then we are comparing the passwords, and if it doesn't work, we don't allow them, but otherwise we set the session and return. So that should handle that for us. And then in our pages auth login, we also need to change this from name, email, password just to email and password, and we can remove this check now, make it much more simple. So email and password is the only two stuff we need. And then we can remove this form field, and this should be state.email. This is also something I forgot to change, and we need to do state.password over here. Then we can remove password confirm and then log in, and login is going to call this function. So back in register also, we don't model the name for everything. We need to do email, password, and password confirm. Right, so that should give us the basis for what we need. If we go back, so now we're on the login page, it looks correct. If I inspect this, let's try to enter test@test.com, test@test.com, and login. You can see that in the console, it gave us the username password, which is the same in this case. And if we don't enter anything, it's going to tell us that we have to enter stuff. If we enter just test, it's going to say invalid, and nothing is going to happen when you try to log in. So in order to be able to log in, we first need to register. And after doing email and password, we're going to add another little link here to say something like log in with GitHub instead, or register with GitHub instead, and handle it that way. So on the register page, let's create a loading ref, which starts out as false. We're going to add also a, actually we're just going to use toast, which comes with Nuxt UI. And then we're going to say that we're going to try catch this. We're going to say that const response equals await, and then we'll use the Nuxt fetch. And this is going to be API auth register. The method will be post. I think it's body will be the event.data, because we're sending it along just like that. Actually, let's be specific and say the name. It's going to be event.data.name, email is that, password is that. So we do not do the password confirm on the server itself. So we also can say that if there's no response.success, means it failed, we can just throw an error. And just say login error. That way we can handle the toast in, registration error. That way we can handle the toast in a single spot in the catch. Otherwise we can say return navigate to and the home page, because now we have a session, or we should have a session. And in this case we can say toast.add, and the color is going to be a error. The title is failed to create account, and we can say the description is going to be something like please, maybe something like please check your details and try again. So that's basically all we'll do for the register page. So in this case, we also want to say loading.value equals true. And then after the catch, we can do a finally. And we can say that loading.value is false. On the button, we could say something like bind the loading state over here. So that handles that. We have an error. Oh, we shouldn't return anything from this. We should just say navigate to. Great, so let's try to sign up. Now we can do, the name is going to be something like Carl Sagan. carl.sagan. And if we try to go, it's going to say it's invalid. So we can do at carlsworld.gg. And the password needs to be 8. So I'm just going to do like password, I believe it's already 8 characters. And then let's make the password incorrect. So it says passwords don't match, nothing's going to happen. Even though, what's it called? One password kind of says that it's good, but it's not. It didn't send any request. But if I do add it like that, register, it's going to load, and then we should have a session. I go to the base route. And there we go. It's a protected page. We have a session now. So one thing that you saw is that it redirected us to the auth login again because the session wasn't available. So what we can do in that case is before redirecting, because once we said navigate to that, the session might not have been set yet. So we could say something like get the user session again, const session equals use user session. So to make sure that we have a fresh session, we can do await session.fetch, I believe. This will then make the request to refresh the session, and then we can say await navigate to, and then go home. So when you do that, then you'll see that you navigate. So let's actually try that out. We can go to first restart the app because I think I closed it down. And then go to the site again. And then inspect, and in inspect, I'm going to go to application and basically just clear all the cookies because now we do have a NAU session in there. If I refresh it, it should take me to login. Okay, but we want to be on register. So we already have registered a user. So if we try to do Carl Sagan again, I think I call that carl.sagan at carlsworld.gg, I believe. And then this shouldn't work because we have a restriction on our database that it should be unique. So it failed to create the account because this already exists, which is nice. So let's do carl2sagan at carlsworld.gg. So if we register now, it should take us to the protected page because we refreshed our session before going to this page. So that's just a little caveat. Okay, so instead of having to clear cookies, let's create a little nav bar that allows us to show the auth state so that we can log in, log out, and all those kind of things. So let's go to, oh, and you can see that we got a constraint unique error, which threw. To create a nav bar, we can simply just do it in the app for now. But if you have multiple layouts, you might want to do it there. We can do it in this layout and then say something like nav. And this is where we can make use of that nice little component that is provided with Nuxt Auth Utils. We can say something like this: navbar needs to be H14, maybe PX10, flex, align center, and then justify between. We can say that the first thing is going to be like an H2, just call it NAU, which is like the title. And then the second thing is going to be the auth state. And this basically allows us to extract the state from this component. The way we do that is we can define a slot, which is your default slot. And that gives us like this default key and the logged in, which is a Boolean, and the clear function. So if the user's logged in, we're going to show log out. If they aren't, then we're going to go to auth login. So if we look at the app now, there is a logout button. If we click on that, and this looks kind of weird, but anyway, if we click on that, you can see it's goes to log in, but we're still on the protected page. So we might want to redirect when that is clicked. So we can do something like the clear. We can instead remove that from here and just say log out, and then up here in a script tag we can do function logout, async function logout, and we can do again const session equals use user session, and then first we'll clear the session, and then we'll navigate to auth login. So that should give us the better flow. So now if we go to auth login, let's try to log in with Carl Sagan at carlsworld.gg, and we can do something like what was that password? I forgot. And obviously nothing will happen because we haven't defined our login route. So it's going to be the same flow. We're going to say const response equals await fetch API auth login. The method is going to be post, and the body is going to be all of that. And then we're just going to say if no response.success, we can throw new error, and then over here say toast.add. The color is going to be an error again. The title failed to log in, and the description all that. So we need toast. We can say const toast equals use toast. And for the response, I've misspelled something. You can do something like that. And then if it was successful, we can say we can refresh the session again. And actually, instead of doing it in here, let's add it to our auth, the whole refreshing thing, so that we don't have to always remember doing that. We can do it in our auth middleware. So we can say just await navigate to that. And then the same thing in register. Instead of refreshing the session, we can go to our auth handler and basically our auth middleware, and basically if there's no session.loggedin value, let's first try to log in. So we can make this async, and then we can say await session.fetch. So to make double sure that there is no, if there was already a cookie, then it's fine, it'll continue, but if there wasn't, we'll make double sure, and then we can check if there's still no session.loggedin.value. So we basically do a double check here. First we check if it isn't there, then we fetch it. If it still isn't there, then we navigate to the auth page. And this is where you might want to set your user in store, etc., because we can get that from const user equals session.user, something like that. So after all of this is ran, then you know you actually have a user. So now logging in should work without having to refresh that user. So let's try again. Carl Sagan at carlsworld.gg. And there we go. So the fetch worked and everything refreshed well. So if I log out now, you can see that the thing takes me back, log in. So that's basically email and password. So now let's have a look at adding OAuth but with GitHub. So I'm going to do this on the login page. If you go to login, and instead of just the login button, we'll add another button. So we can add an icon. I want to do a leading icon. It's going to be PH I think I copied this already, the GitHub logo duotone, and then we can just say login with GitHub. So that's going to be our entry point to initiating the login. So now you can see login with GitHub and login. It looks a little bit strange. We can maybe just fix that up a little bit. We could do it super simple, something like this. We should probably work on the design of our app a little bit, but it's fine. So this is quite confusing. Wait, it's gonna bother me. So I'm gonna do something like AP, just gonna say or, and then switch this up. Basically put this over here and put, come on. And then put this after the or. Should look a little better, I believe. Yeah, okay, so it's not great. So when we click this, we want to redirect to GitHub and use our GitHub login to get back to our OAuth handler, which we need to set up, and then create the user in the database if it doesn't exist yet, and then go to the login page. So let's do that. Okay, so for the OAuth endpoint, we'll create that in server, but instead of API, we're going to create a routes folder. And then in routes, we're going to create a folder called OAuth. And then in OAuth, we're going to create a github.get.ts. And I'm going to paste this from the documentation just to save a little bit more time. But as you can see, we use this composable, define OAuth GitHub event handler, which is coming from Nuxt Auth Utils. So you can see that GitHub also sends back tokens once that is done, but we're only interested in the user. So in this case, it's only setting the session to the user. So we aren't even storing the user in our database. And I'm not going to add those steps for now. What I'll do is basically just add a comment here, use the user to set in DB. And you can basically check, so you can get user.email, I think, you can get user.id, you can get all those things that you can then copy into your own database. You could also check that if the user email is already defined in our database, then don't authenticate because, or don't set the user, because then it's a login instead of a register. But in this case, we're just gonna add the ID, which would be the user.id, and a name, which is the user.name. So this could be the way you handle GitHub logins, and then send the redirect back to the home page, or on error, just send it back, or log it out and send it back. So this is all you need for your GitHub event handler. So the way we're going to do that is basically in our pages, and then auth login. Can log in with GitHub. We're going to add a to property here, and we're going to say /auth/git, I think it's /OAuth GitHub, like that. So by defining that, we should have everything available to direct to that endpoint. So if we log in with GitHub, I had to refresh the page because I don't think it had sort of hot module reloading there, but now you can see NAU tutorial by me, personal access, then authorize me. If you authorize me, it sends it back to the application based on the redirect, and now you can see that we're logged in. We can see our protected page, and that's because the one thing that might be a little bit confusing is that you use the same endpoint in your code like this as the endpoint that GitHub redirects to. So by default or automatically, the server endpoint in routes knows where it's coming from. So if you request it, then it's going to create the redirect. If GitHub requests it, it's going to automatically handle everything, and you can set the user session in that case, which logs the user in. So before leaving you be, I just want to show you quickly some extra utils. So the use user session one thus far. We can get the session.user.value.name to show on that home page, for example. So you can access the user. I'm sort of asserting that it exists here because we know that the auth middleware handled that. On the server side, there's a couple of things we can do. We can create a plugins folder, and then in plugins we can create a auth.ts plugin, export default define Nitro plugin, and in this plugin we can hook into the session hooks.hook, and there's a thing called fetch. Over here we get access to the session and the event. And what we can do is augment the session over here. So we could say something like session.thing that changes often or whatever equals true, and return that session. So basically what's happening is that when we store something on the cookie, when we request to sort of decrypt that cookie, the stuff that we add over here isn't put in the cookie itself, it's put in the response. So we can put only the ID, for instance, on the cookie, and then get the ID from the session.user.id to fetch more things, for example, to return to the client. That's just one example. And the other cool thing is, like, for instance, we can create a whoami sort of endpoint, and then there are two things. We can get user session, which gives you a session.user, but this user is maybe undefined. If you want to ensure that the user is there and throw an error, you can say require user session. If it can't find the user, it's going to throw an error, a 401 response error, and then we can basically just turn session.user to the client for a whoami endpoint. So there's quite a few cool things that you can do with these composables that makes life a little bit easier. So I just wanted to show that to you quickly. So that was my little rundown on Nuxt Auth Utils, showing some of the composables, the ways to add middleware, how you can add OAuth, how you can redirect things. It's a quick rundown. It's not very detailed, but I hope you got something out of it. If you did enjoy it, maybe consider leaving a like on this video. And if you really enjoyed it, consider subscribing. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.